Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our tour through my Penguin Classic wall back there, much promised for many years, now finally delivering. I was going to do it originally as just an ordinary shelf tour, 10 or 11 books at a time. Then I decided I was out of time in 2019 to do that, and after a little reflection, I realized I don't want to do that. That I want to give these the attention that I give them in person. That is one of the walls where I just wander around with Frida in my arm like that. I just wander around looking at these things, wondering about them, thinking about them, when I should be doing other stuff. And it's one of the walls where I do that. And we have moved away from strict predictability. We've moved away from the ancient world and the Renaissance. We are now out in the wilds of my relatively unorganized remainder, except that I seem to have settled into doing a row of Penguin Classic Deluxe editions. The beautiful paperbacks that they do of some classics that just they have heavier quality cardstock for the cover. They have French flaps. They have deckled edges. They have newly commissioned cover artwork, usually a newly commissioned introduction, and they are just gorgeous things, just beautiful. There's a part of me, of course, that heretically wishes that all Penguin Classics were Penguin Classic Deluxe editions, but that feels like heresy because I know the Black Spine Classics so well. I've lived with them for so long. But we're doing we're going to do probably 2 weeks of Penguin Classic Deluxe editions. And the one we're doing today is a delight. It's a delight to share it with you. It's Appointment in Samarra by John O'Hara, the great American writer John O'Hara, with an introduction by Charles McGrath, who's no small potatoes when it comes to writing himself. I myself don't particularly like this cover. It goes on around like that, and it goes into the flaps like that. The flaps for Penguin Classic Deluxe editions don't have any text on them. The back doesn't have any text on them. So to showcase the artwork, a wonderful idea. It's just this particular art style. This is who does this? Who does this cover? Neil Gower. And I don't know if this is his usual style or if he was trying to mimic the 1930s or whatever, but doesn't do it for me at all. Maybe some of you would like it, but one way or another, I'm overjoyed that Penguin does this book, that they do this book at all. This was John O'Hara's debut. He wrote it in 1933 in the course of only a few months. It took him. He wrote it extremely fast. It came to him, and he worked hard at it. He was 28 at the time, and produced it with a minimum of fuss, with a minimum of Mandarin condescension, and just created this manuscript. It's the story of Gibbsville, a small town in Pennsylvania, Gibbsville, a fictional town called Gibbsville, and a man named Julian English, who is respectable. He himself is also young. He's in his late 20s, early 30s, and he is the owner of the Cadillac dealership in town. Gibbsville is the name I was trying to come up with. Gibbsville is the name of the town. I always stumble over it. But he is respectably married, and his father is his parents are respectable pillars of the community. They still live nearby, and he is part of all of the suburban givens of the upwardly mobile life in 1930s America. There are the clubs that they're a part of. There's the round of invitations and parties and whatnot. There's prohibition, but the book is absolutely soaked in alcohol. And the book, I mean, it's about Julian English. It's about all the other people in town too. A handful of other characters that are very well drawn, including a bootlegger. But the central part of the book is the complete collapse of Julian English's life, not from any external source. He just decides to do a series of things that cause his life to fall apart completely. By the end, the collapse is complete. And it has a weird kind of fascination to it. He has it all. He has all the things you're supposed to want in life. And he seems to be taking a kind of unavoidable, unchangeable, and perverse enjoyment out of just intentionally destroying it all in a way that is maybe not 100% explicable in the course of the book, but that is so mesmerizing to read. Just so mesmerizing. I cannot praise this author, just in general, high enough. I want to read you Just a bit of a scene. I'm not sure that I was thinking about this. I'm not sure that any scene that I could read would work to show you what this author is doing. But I'm going to give it a try, just in case you've never encountered this author before and never heard it. This is just one. Julian and his wife are visiting his parents at Christmas time. So snow piled everywhere, totally picturesque Pennsylvania town with the holly and the wreaths in the windows and the Christmas trees and all of that, the icicles and whatnot. One look at his father told Julian that the old man had not heard anything about the scene in the smoking room of the country club, and that scene is the one that starts the book, where Julian throws a drink at someone for no good reason. And that is the pebble that starts the avalanche. The old man greeted him about as usual, with a Merry Christmas thrown in, but Julian expected that. He knew there was nothing wrong when he saw the old man's mustache flatten back and the crow's feet behind his shell-rimmed spectacles wrinkle up in the smile that he saved for Carolyn, that's his wife. Well, Carolyn, said the doctor, he took Carolyn's right hand in his own and put his left on her shoulder. Help you with your coat? Thank you, Father English, she said. She put her packages down on the hall table and was helped out of her mink coat. The old man took it to the closet under the stairs and put it on a hanger. Haven't seen you, and I guess it must be 2 weeks, he said. No? Christmas preparations? Yes, I know. We didn't do very much in the way of shopping. I thought it over, and I told Mrs. English, I said, I think checks would be more appropriate this year, wherever you can. Doctor, came the voice, that's his wife. Oh, there she is now, said the doctor. Merry Christmas, Carolyn called out. Merry Christmas, Mother, shouted Julian. Oh, you're here, she replied, and appeared at the top of the steps. I was just about to say we ought to call you up. It must have been a good party at the club. Julian saw his father's expression change. Mrs. English came downstairs and kissed Carolyn and then Julian. Notice we're not told how or why her expression changed. You're supposed to be paying attention to this scene. It's incredibly adult for a young man to have written this. Anyway, let's move on just a bit. I won't belabor it. Now, let's all have a nice cocktail, said Mrs. English, and then you can tell Ursula to start serving while everything's still hot. That's the maid. You two are so late. What kept you? Did you really get in so late last night? How was the dance? I couldn't get the car started, said Julian. Cold. What? Said the old man. Couldn't get it started? I thought that apparatus you put in your garage. I thought... It wasn't in the garage. I left it out all night, said Julian. Our driveway was blocked, said Carolyn. We're out in the real country. It was drifted as high as the roof. Was it? Said the doctor. I never knew it to drift that high out where you are. Remarkable. Well, I suppose a martini. Martini, Carolyn? Fine for me, said Carolyn. What about you, Julian? Now, Carolyn, said the doctor, he'll drink anything, and you know it. See our tree, said Julian's mother. Such a skimpy little thing, but there's so much trouble. I like a spruce, but there's so much trouble I don't think it's worth it when there aren't any children in the house. We have a small tree, too, said Carolyn. When Julian was a boy, do you remember those trees? You must have been here during the holidays when he had a tree, weren't you, Carolyn? No, I don't think I ever was. Julian used to hate me then, remember? Funny, isn't it, said Julian's mother. Tch. When I look back, you're right. He didn't like to play with you, but my gracious, I don't think he disliked you. He was in awe of you. But we all were, still are. Carolyn gave her mother-in-law a hug. Oh, now, Mother, she said, Julian did hate me, probably because I was older. Well, you wouldn't think it now, said the older woman. I mean that both ways. You wouldn't think he ever hated you, and you certainly wouldn't think you were older. Julian, why don't you ever go to the Y or something? Let me look. Turn your face over that way. You are getting a double chin. Julian, really? Very busy man, said Julian. Here we are, said the doctor. Drink this one, Carolyn, and you and I can have another before we sit down. We can all have another one, said his wife, but we'll have to take it into the table with us. I don't want to keep the girls any later than necessary. But that doesn't mean you're to bolt your food. Bad for the digestion. And it goes on from there. It's all meant to be very, very ordinary. But look at all the stuff lurking around there. One of the things that you can't tell from the context I have to give you is that in the scene, Julian is virtually mute. When he's in the presence of his parents, he is suddenly not master of his domain. He's suddenly being humiliated, being reminded of being in awe of his wife when they were children, being told by his mother that he has a double chin and being handled while that is demonstrated, and being his own father just sort of offhandedly mentioning that he'll drink anything that's put in front of him if it's alcoholic. He goes almost completely silent, starts speaking in sentence fragments in the scene, and you have to pay attention to see that. At no point does O'Hara actually come out and tell you he talked a lot less when he was around his parents because he was feeling edibly inhibited or any crap like that. You have to meet him halfway. He's writing this for adults. He's writing this for you to pay attention and know the world that he's giving you. And it's just fantastic. The title refers to a quote from Somerset Maugham, the famous epigraph of this book that I want to read to you in case you don't know it. This is how the book starts. Death speaks. There was a merchant in Baghdad who sent his servant to market to buy provisions, and in a little while the servant came back, white and trembling, and said, "Master, just now I was in the marketplace, and I was jostled by a woman in the crowd, and when I turned I saw it was Death that jostled me. She looked at me and made a threatening gesture. 'Now lend me your horse, and I will ride away from the city and avoid my fate. I will go to Samarra, and there Death will not find me.' The merchant lent him his horse, and the servant mounted it, and he dug his spurs in the flanks, and as fast as the horse could gallop away, he went. Then the merchant went down to the marketplace, and he saw me, that is Death, standing in the crowd, and he came to me and said, 'Why did you make a threatening gesture to my servant when you saw him this morning?' 'That was not a threatening gesture,' I said. 'It was only a start of surprise. I was astonished to see him in Baghdad, for I had an appointment with him tonight in Samarra.'" And the reason for that epigraph, the whole thing, is that there's an element of a feeling of ineluctable fate that rules this book. It's so chilling. The tighter the grip comes, it starts right away with the throw and drink, but the tighter the grip comes as the book goes on, the more you're just raging against it, saying, well, all right, yes, your parents are a little overbearing, and yes, your wife is a little bit pettish and demanding, and yes, your suburban world is a little predictable and a little bit of a straitjacket. But there are all sorts of ways to get around that. There are all sorts of accommodations that you can make or adaptations you can make that you're not making. It creates that kind of a tension between its plot and its reader in a way that works every bit now. It's almost impossible for me to believe that this book is almost 100 years old. It's almost impossible for me to believe that, but nevertheless, it works every bit as much now as it did then. And fortunately for us as readers, Charles McGrath is pretty sympathetic to that in his introduction. His introduction is pretty good. He does say something that I cannot disagree with strongly enough. He writes that along with The Scarlet Letter, The Sun Also Rises, The Moviegoer, and Catch-22, this is one of the handful of American novels that represent both the author's first published effort and his best. That is total nonsense. Total nonsense. I have no idea how Charles McGrath could actually believe that. But I'm here to tell you, whether you hear it from him or not, whether you read it in the Penguin Classic Introduction or not, that is total nonsense on the part of every one of those authors. Catch-22 is not Joseph Heller's best book. This is not John O'Hara's best book at all. Sun Also Rises is not the best Hemingway. And so on and so forth. The Scarlet Letter is, of course, well known from being taught in school, but it's nowhere near as good as The House of the Seven Gables. And to say that this is the best thing that John O'Hara ever wrote, when he wrote a score of novels and a score of collections of short stories, and when all of those short stories are great, almost all of them are great, he wrote forever in the New Yorker, short story after short story after short story. And if you go to he is gone from print now. The Penguin does a couple of representative volumes, but the vast bulk, 90% of what he wrote, is out of print and will probably stay that way. But you, at a yard sale, when they reconvene at a library sale, you can often find a whole table full of old paperbacks of The Horse Knew the Way, or The Hat on the Bed, or 10 North Frederick, or whatever. Tons of short story collections, tons of novels. Get one of them. And you won't be sorry. Don't believe Charles McGrath when he tells you that this is the best thing this author ever wrote at age 28 when he was writing until he was 70. But one of the reasons why his appreciation as a writer has lagged so far behind his worth as a writer, that he is tremendously good. He deserves to be mentioned in the same breath with the contemporaries that he knew and liked, Hemingway and Fitzgerald. He deserves to be mentioned in the same breath with them. He is just as good as they are. And one of the reasons why he's not remembered that way is an incredibly effective job at literary reputation assassination, which can be done either by the author or by someone else, by an enemy of the author. It's almost always done posthumously, because authors can be querulous, they can be litigious. In, for instance, the case of Anthony Trollope, he did it himself. His autobiography was published posthumously and laid out a picture of the artist at work in his study as a butcher at the table. So many links per day. Mrs. Nelson's waiting for her 12 pounds. It totally stripped the romance from the idea of a writer, and readers in retrospect thought, oh, well, if you're measuring your day's creativity by how many hours you worked and how many words you got written in every quarter hour, then why do I want to read your books? It took a long time for Trollope's reputation to survive the damage that his own autobiography did to it. But in John O'Hara's case, it wasn't anything he did. He led a stereotypical writer's life. He could be a little buffoonish. At times, he had social pretensions, and they went unfulfilled. Those have been exaggerated. That whole element of his life is exaggerated. If you'd gone back and met him at the time, you wouldn't have come up. You wouldn't have noticed it. They were exaggerated in the same source and by the same person who also did the rest of the reputation assassination here. And that person was Brendan Gill, who worked with John O'Hara at the New Yorker for a long, long time, and who was a middling, talented author in his own right. He wrote one good novel. This author wrote 10. He wrote one good novel, and a couple of other good things. Some of his nonfiction is good. But one piece of his nonfiction was a skyrocketing bestseller, far more than anything else. If Brendan Gill is remembered for anything today, he's remembered for a nonfiction work called Here at the New Yorker, a long anecdotal story of all the different colorful characters at the New Yorker and all the stuff they got up to and all the wonderful memories that Gill could give of them. And very subtly woven throughout that book is a consistent character assassination of John O'Hara that I believe was incredibly successful in poisoning the well about this author. O'Hara died in 1970. Here at the New Yorker came out in 1975. Nice and safe when O'Hara was gone. He would certainly have sued and would have won. It's an extremely defamatory account that cannot be verified. Most of what Gill says in that book about this author can't be verified. But one way or another, whether it can be verified or not, whether O'Hara would have sued if the book had come out in his lifetime or not, one thing is for sure. If you read Here at the New Yorker, and believe it or not, I am encouraging you to do that. It is a terrific book to read. Just terrific. But when you read it, you will come out of it thinking, you might think one thing or another about James Thurber. He doesn't come off all that well either. But you will come out of it thinking that John O'Hara is a talentless, bloated fool. And I believe that worked. I really do. I know it's simplistic. I know there are other factors at play, but I believe it worked. To an unbelievable, unholy extent, I think it killed the reputation of John O'Hara, and it's only that Here at the New Yorker is out of print, that the din of that is starting to die down. A whole new generation of readers is occasionally, periodically, spottily finding this author and finding out he's absolutely great. Well, long may that continue. For in this particular case, I would say there are plenty of copies of Here at the New Yorker in print that have been printed, so there are plenty of chances for you to get a used copy. I'd maybe argue that it shouldn't be reprinted in a new version. We don't need to go through all that again. Instead, what the publishing world ought to do is reprint all of John O'Hara. Give him another chance. It wasn't fair. He couldn't defend himself. It wasn't fair what that book did to his reputation, especially since the proof is in the pudding. The books hold up. The stories hold up. If you get a big collection of John O'Hara short stories, I predict you will love them. You maybe not all of them, but you will love them. I really wish that there were a 1,000-page collection of just a huge number of short stories. As far as I know, such a volume does not exist. But if there were, I think Everyman's Library does a big collection of short stories by this author. And if you were to read through that volume, I am convinced that when you're done with it, you would say, okay, well, I don't know anything about this author. I'm not sure that the things I've heard about him sound all that appealing. Steve says a lot of those things were made up by Brendan Gill. Maybe so, maybe not. But one thing I can tell you for sure is that the volume of short stories that I just read is as good as any volume of short stories that I've read by anybody, including Chekhov, including Guy de Maupassant, including John Cheever. That was a discovery. This is an amazing voice. I loved it. Totally adult. Totally unsparing. Totally bare-knuckled. and yet wonderfully done. So your Penguin Classic today is a wholehearted recommendation. That line, Charles McGrath's introduction is very good otherwise, but that line about this being the best thing this author ever wrote, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Ernest Hemingway, and Walker Percy, and Joseph Heller, absolutely absurd. Don't believe it. But aside from that, this is a very strong recommendation. I am so glad that Penguin dipped their toe into this author and came out with some, and Library of America also did. Library of America has also done a couple of volumes that are well worth your time. If I remember again, I don't think I ever wrote about this Penguin volume, but I know I wrote about at least one of those Library of America volumes. So I will leave a link to it down below if I remember to do that. But once again, especially now that we're moving into stuff that's more contemporary, and so there may be a review by me. Once again, I should say that if I forget, if I just get distracted and don't remember, if you type in my first and my last name into Google, and then the first and last name of whatever author you're interested in that you wonder if I've written about it, that's a good way to tell whether or not I have. That will tend to get you results. But one way or another, your Penguin Classic for today is a Penguin Classic Deluxe Edition. It doesn't need to be a deluxe edition. Appointment at Samarra has had many editions. But it's a wholehearted recommendation. You would love it. Absolutely love it. And I would hope that you would allow it enough so that it would form an introduction to this author, because he's well worth your time to read. As an American author, as a chronicler of his time, he's well worth your time to read. So that sort of takes the James Joyce taint out of the mouth, and we'll see what tomorrow brings. Let's hope it's not more Joyce. So who knows what it'll be. We'll find out together tomorrow. So I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.